Iran wrote a law this week that they think finally puts them back in control of the world's most important choke point. And on the surface, it looks like a win for them. It's August 8th, 2026, and Tehran did something that's going to look, years from now, like one of the biggest unforced errors in modern Iranian history. They took a threat they've been making for months, floating it in speeches, floating it through state media, floating it through military spokesmen, and this week they turned it into actual legislation. A real bill moving through a real parliamentary committee with real numbers attached to it. Fines, tolls, bans, all spelled out in black and white. On paper, this looks like Iran finally clawing back something after 6 months of getting absolutely hammered militarily. But if you actually sit down and read what's inside this bill, and then you look at everything happening around it, the sanctions, the reroutes, the reactions from Iran's own neighbors, you start to realize Iran didn't write a law that hands them leverage. They wrote a law that's going to follow them around for the next 20 years, maybe longer. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why this is going to haunt them. So here's the roadmap for today. We're going to break down exactly what's inside this new Hormuz legislation, the tolls, the bans, the compensation clauses, and why it reads less like a maritime regulation and more like a ransom note typed up by people who think they still hold all the cards. Then we're getting into the legal problem nobody in Tehran wants to talk about, because Iran built this entire law on a legal foundation that doesn't actually exist under international maritime law, and we'll get into exactly why that matters. After that, we're covering the sanctions response that's already dismantling this thing piece by piece before it's even fully passed both houses. Then we'll get into the part that really matters most, the part where I walk you through exactly why this law is going to cost Iran the very leverage it was designed to protect, and why that damage is permanent instead of temporary. And then we've got a lot to cover in the global roundup section, including a missile attack on a South Korean commercial ship that Seoul just formally pinned on Iranian weaponry. A very quiet legal move out of Beijing that tells you a lot about where this economic standoff is heading next, and a look at how Iran's own neighbor might be quietly building a way around this entire law. So stick around, because this one connects a lot of dots. And I don't think most people are actually seeing the full picture yet. Let's rewind for a second so all of this makes sense in context. Back on February 28th of this year, the United States and Israel launched military operations against Iran. That's when this whole war formally started, though tensions had obviously been building for a long time before that. Iran's response, alongside missile and drone strikes against American allies and Israeli targets across the region, was to choke the Strait of Hormuz. Not fully close it in the sense of physically blockading it with warships lined up bow to stern, but restrict it, harass it, mine the psychological edges of it, so that shipping companies got scared and started pulling their vessels out voluntarily. And it worked, at least in the short term. Traffic through the strait dropped by more than 90% at the peak of the fighting. That's a fifth of the world's oil supply and a massive chunk of global liquefied natural gas, either sitting completely still in the Gulf or getting rerouted thousands of extra miles around the Cape of Good Hope just to avoid the region entirely. Crude oil prices jumped roughly $20 a barrel compared to where they sat before the war began, settling in around $83 a barrel by early August, which tells you the market still hasn't fully priced in a return to normal. A ceasefire took hold on April 8th, brokered through Pakistani mediation, and President Trump later extended that ceasefire indefinitely rather than letting it lapse back into open conflict. But here's the thing about a ceasefire that people sometimes forget. It stops the shooting. It does not automatically restore the way things worked before the shooting started. And Iran understood that distinction better than almost anyone. So while the guns went quiet, Tehran didn't sit back and wait for global shipping to just resume like nothing ever happened. They went and built an entire bureaucratic architecture, specifically designed to make sure that even in peacetime, they'd still have their hand wrapped around the throat of the global economy. That architecture started with something called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, stood up on May 5th, just weeks after the ceasefire took hold. On paper, it's a maritime regulatory body. In practice, every serious analyst who has looked at it agrees it's essentially an IRGC-run toll booth wearing a government logo. The PGSA claimed that no vessel could legally pass through the Strait of Hormuz without a permit issued directly by them. They drew out a supervision zone stretching from a line connecting Khu Mubarak on Iran's coast all the way across to the southern edge of Fujairah in the UAE, and on the western side, from the end of Keshem Island across toward al-Kaiwain. Basically, they mapped out the entire strait and said, this whole area now requires our permission. It didn't take long for the United States to respond. On May 28th, the Treasury Department sanctioned the PGSA outright, and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent didn't mince words about it. He described the entity as Iran's latest attempt to monetize its campaign of state-sponsored terror by extorting global maritime trade, and he tied it directly to something Treasury has branded economic fury, which is essentially the modern rebrand of the original maximum pressure sanctions campaign, now aimed at squeezing the regime financially until it either negotiates seriously or starts cracking internally. But Iran didn't stop at just the PGSA. They kept building. They stood up a company called Hormuz Safe Marine Services Authority, and alongside it something called the Persian Gulf Marine Insurance Company, both designed with one specific purpose: to force commercial vessels to purchase mandatory so-called insurance policies just to secure guaranteed safe passage through the strait. Think about what that actually means functionally. Pay us for insurance, or we can't promise your ship won't get hit by one of our own mines or missiles. That's not an insurance product. That's a protection racket wearing a business suit. And, right on schedule, the Treasury sanctioned both of those entities on July 29th, folding them into the same economic fury enforcement action, describing the whole operation as an extortion network built specifically to squeeze commercial shipping for cash the regime desperately needs. Now here's where it gets interesting, because this week, Iran's parliament pushed the next and biggest step forward. They advanced a formal bill, officially titled the Strategic Action for the Security and Sustainable Development of the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf. It's a mouthful, and it's clearly designed to sound like responsible governance, rather than what it actually is. Strip away the bureaucratic language, and here's what the bill actually does, provision by provision. First, it bans American and Israeli vessels from the strait outright, no exceptions, full stop, permanently. Second, it bans any cargo linked to Israel from transiting at all, whether that cargo is military or purely civilian, meaning even humanitarian or commercial goods tied to Israeli companies get caught in the net. Third, and this is the part that should make every shipping executive on the planet extremely nervous, it states that any country Iran determines has caused it damage during the conflict will not be permitted to pass through the strait until compensation is paid directly to Tehran. Fourth, it imposes a toll of up to 7% of a vessel's entire cargo value simply for the privilege of using what has always been recognized as an international waterway, open to all nations. Fifth, and this is the one that really tells you everything about the mindset behind this bill, if you violate any of Iran's conditions once you're already in the strait, they're proposing a fine equal to 20% of your cargo's total value. 20%. Sit with that number for a second. If you're moving a very large crude carrier worth $80 million in oil, Iran is claiming the legal right to fine you $16 million for not following their rules in a strait they do not have exclusive sovereign ownership over. And this isn't even theoretical anymore, because shipping intelligence firms have already documented individual vessels quietly paying Iran roughly $2 million per ship just to guarantee safe transit, completely outside any formal legal system, funneled straight into an organization the U.S. Treasury has already formally labeled a sanctioned extortion network run by the IRGC. So let's talk about why this entire law is legally, and I mean fundamentally, built on sand. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iranian and Omani territorial waters. Nobody on Earth disputes that basic geography. What Iran is trying to claim is that because significant portions of the strait fall inside their own territorial waters, they automatically get to dictate who passes through and under what financial terms. But that is simply not how international maritime law has worked for decades, and it's not some obscure legal technicality either. Under a principle called transit passage, formally recognized under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, international straits used for global navigation have to remain open to all shipping, all flags, all nations, even in the specific portions that run through a coastal state's own territorial waters. You cannot legally charge a toll for exercising transit passage. You cannot legally ban a flag state from using an international strait just because you're politically upset with their government. This right exists specifically because choke points like Hormuz, the Bosphorus, the Strait of Malacca, and Bab el-Mandeb are simply too economically important to global trade to ever be held hostage by whichever single country happens to border them. Compare this to how Turkey handles the Bosphorus under the Montreux Convention, a legitimate, internationally negotiated treaty that both grants Turkey certain regulatory rights and simultaneously guarantees free passage for commercial shipping. That's the legitimate version of what Iran is trying to fake here, except Turkey actually negotiated that framework with the rest of the world instead of just unilaterally declaring it through a domestic parliamentary vote. Now, Iran's legal defense here is actually kind of remarkable in just how weak it is once you examine it closely. They point out that they signed the Law of the Sea Convention back in 1982, but never actually ratified it, so technically, they argue, they're not bound by its specific treaty terms, which, sure, that's a legal argument you could theoretically make in a law school debate. But transit passage isn't just a treaty rule sitting in one convention. It's widely recognized as customary international law, meaning it's binding on essentially every state on Earth, regardless of whether they formally signed and ratified a specific piece of paper. because it reflects how the entire international community has actually operated for generations. So Iran can write whatever they want into their own domestic parliament. That legislative act doesn't change how the rest of the planet is going to treat that law in practice. The United States has already said flatly that it rejects Iran's claim to control the strait. Full stop. Gulf Arab states, the very neighbors Iran desperately needs some level of goodwill from, have vocally and publicly rejected the idea too. And even Oman, the other country that actually shares legitimate legal jurisdiction over the strait, is not exactly rushing to co-sign Iran's version of events. Reports indicate Oman is handling this with what's been described as deliberate strategic ambiguity, meaning they're staying quiet publicly, while simultaneously negotiating a separate parallel framework with Iran for how ships would actually move through the strait, one that would split traffic into a northern corridor closer to the Iranian coast for entry, and a southern corridor closer to the Omani coast for exit. Which, if you think about that for a second, is essentially Iran's own neighbor quietly building a workaround, so the rest of the world doesn't have to fully rely on or trust Tehran's toll booth to get their ships through safely. Now let's talk about the compensation clause, because this is honestly where Iran's law starts eating its own tail in real time. Remember, President Trump has already stated publicly that some of Iran's frozen assets currently under U.S. control will be used to compensate shipping companies that suffered real damage during the war, ships that got hit by mines, missiles, drones, or sabotage throughout the conflict. Iran's official response to that was, frankly, unhinged. Their military command, operating under something called the Khatam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters, basically announced that any vessel belonging to a country or company that accepts compensation from those frozen Iranian assets will be permanently barred from ever transiting the Strait of Hormuz again. Think through the actual logic here for a second. The United States says, we're going to pay you back for the damage Iran did to your ship, using Iran's own frozen money that we control. And Iran's response is, if you accept that payment, we will punish you further by permanently banning you from our strait. That's not a coherent policy position. That's a hostage taker threatening the hostage's family for daring to call the police for help. It's genuinely one of the strangest pieces of statecraft to come out of this entire conflict. And it tells you everything you need to know about the mindset actually driving this legislation. It was never about restoring normal global shipping patterns. It's about maximizing leverage in every possible direction and punishing anyone who doesn't play along. Even when playing along, means simply accepting Iran's own frozen money as a form of apology for damage Iran itself caused. So now let's get into why this law is going to haunt Iran, not for a single news cycle, not for one fiscal quarter, but for years, quite possibly for decades. And it starts with something that should genuinely terrify anyone in Tehran who actually understands how global energy markets function. Every single day that Iran keeps this law sitting on the books, keeps threatening tolls, keeps threatening outright bans, keeps threatening 20% fines, the rest of the world gets better and better at not needing the Strait of Hormuz at all. Saudi Arabia has already pushed its east-west pipeline, the one running from its eastern oil fields all the way across to Red Sea terminals, up to a record 7 million barrels a day, well past what it was originally engineered to carry, specifically by converting existing gas liquid pipelines over to full crude oil service. That's oil that used to flow through Hormuz, and now simply does not have to anymore. The UAE has comparable bypass infrastructure running through Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman side, completely sidestepping the strait altogether for a meaningful share of its exports. Every single month, this law sits there actively threatening ships. More of that bypass infrastructure gets built out. More long-term supply contracts get signed around it, and more insurance markets permanently adjust their long-term risk models to assume Hormuz is structurally unreliable going forward. And here's the part that really matters. Infrastructure, once it's built and once contracts are signed around it, doesn't just get torn down the moment Iran decides to play nice again next year. Nobody spends billions of dollars converting pipeline systems and building alternate export terminals, and then rips it all out simply because a regime that just spent 6 months trying to extort them says, okay, we're good now, you can come back through our strait. Iran is essentially training the entire global energy market to build a world that structurally doesn't need them anymore. And once that muscle memory sets into corporate supply chains and long-term shipping contracts, it becomes permanent. That's not a threat or an exaggeration. That's just basic supply chain behavior, and Iran is actively accelerating it with every single clause written into this bill. Then there's the sanctions trail, which is honestly one of the most self-defeating parts of this entire strategy when you step back and look at the pattern. Every single entity Iran creates to enforce this law gets formally sanctioned within weeks of standing it up. The Persian Gulf Strait Authority, sanctioned. Hormuz Safe Marine Services, sanctioned. The so-called insurance company, sanctioned. And Treasury has been explicit and repeated in stating that anyone who cooperates with these entities, any bank, any insurer, any shipping company, any port authority anywhere in the world, is exposing themselves to serious secondary sanctions risk, because functionally they'd be doing business with the IRGC. So think about what Iran is actually constructing here with this pattern of behavior. It's not building a functioning toll system that generates sustainable revenue. It's building a permanent blacklist generator. Every new agency they stand up to enforce this law becomes just another sanctioned entity, another name added to a list that international banks and insurers will avoid touching for years, possibly for decades. The exact same way entities tied to Iran's shadow oil fleet from years earlier are still considered financially radioactive in global markets today. Sanctions lists don't just quietly evaporate once a conflict ends. They compound over time and stack on top of each other. And Iran is voluntarily feeding brand new names into that machine every few weeks, seemingly without any plan for how to unwind it later. And here's the legal problem that really is going to follow Iran around long after this specific war becomes a distant memory. By formally legislating a claim that directly contradicts customary international law, and by putting it in writing in an actual parliamentary bill, complete with actual percentages, actual enforcement mechanisms, and actual name penalties, Iran has created a permanent, citable, on-the-record admission that they do not consider themselves bound by the rules the rest of the maritime world operates under. That matters enormously in future disputes, and lawyers on every side of this conflict know it. Every future insurance claim, every arbitration case, every future negotiation over shipping rights, war risk premiums, or reflagging disputes is going to be able to point directly back to this exact piece of legislation as documented proof of intent. Iran didn't just violate international maritime norms during active wartime, which countries sometimes do, and can later argue, was justified under self-defense doctrine. They sat down during an active ceasefire in a time of relative peace and wrote a formal law claiming the standing right to extort, ban, and fine commercial vessels on a permanent, ongoing, indefinite basis. That is a fundamentally different legal posture than wartime conduct, and it's one that plaintiffs' attorneys, insurance underwriters, and foreign ministries around the world are going to be citing in disputes for a very long time to come. You simply cannot unwrite a law once it's been passed and published. It's on the books, it's dated, it's public record, and it will genuinely outlive whatever specific government happens to be sitting in Tehran by the time this broader conflict finally truly ends. All right, let's move into the global roundup section, because there's a lot happening around this main story that connects directly back to it. First, South Korea's foreign ministry just wrapped up a weeks-long formal investigation into an attack on one of their commercial vessels, the HMM Namu, which was struck back on May 4th, while it sat stranded in the Strait of Hormuz during the height of the wartime blockade. The ship took 2 separate hits from unidentified airborne objects. The first warhead failed to detonate on impact. The second one did, sparking a fire on board and injuring one of the 24 crew members. After carefully analyzing engine debris and warhead fragments recovered from the vessel, South Korean investigators concluded that the components were consistent with Iranian-made Nor series anti-ship missiles, the exact same family of weapons used by Iran's Navy, by the IRGC, and by Iran-aligned proxy groups scattered throughout the region. Seoul's own first vice foreign minister stopped just short of officially declaring it a deliberate, intentional Iranian government strike, but she stated plainly that multiple pieces of evidence point toward Iran, and South Korea formally summoned Iran's ambassador to deliver an official protest over the incident. Iran, predictably and immediately, denied any involvement whatsoever, with their ambassador in Seoul insisting his country took no part in it at all. But here's the thing about credibility, and Iran seems to keep learning this exact lesson the hard way over and over again throughout this entire conflict. When you're simultaneously running a maritime extortion scheme through sanctioned shell companies, allegedly striking a 5th-generation stealth fighter with ground fire, sending proxy drones into unrelated regional conflicts, and denying an attack that your own recovered weapon fragments trace directly back to, the rest of the world simply stops extending you the benefit of the doubt. That's not an insult toward Iran. That's just how pattern recognition naturally works among foreign ministries and intelligence services, watching all of this unfold in real time. Second item for the roundup, and this one is a lot quieter on the surface, but arguably more important for the long-term picture. Back in May, China issued its very first formal blocking order, specifically targeting American sanctions enforcement. Now, a blocking order, if you're not familiar with the legal mechanism, is essentially a tool a government uses to legally prohibit its own domestic companies from complying with another country's sanctions regime. It's a tactic the European Union has used in the past to try to shield its firms from American secondary sanctions and other disputes. China, deploying this specific legal tool for the first time in its history, right in the middle of this ongoing Hormuz standoff, tells you something genuinely important about where things might be heading. It suggests Beijing may be quietly preparing legal cover for Chinese shipping companies, insurers, and trading firms to keep doing business with Iran or with entities tied to Iran, even as Washington continues tightening the sanctions net around Tehran. That's a meaningful escalation in how this broader economic conflict is shaping up, because it means Iran's toll law, even while it's getting systematically sanctioned into oblivion by American Treasury actions, might still find a functioning lane to operate through Chinese-linked shipping and insurance markets that are increasingly willing to operate entirely outside the American-led financial system. It doesn't save Iran's law from being fundamentally illegal under international norms, and it doesn't make Western shippers any more willing to touch it, but it might buy Iran's scheme a longer functional lifespan than Washington would ideally like to see. Third item worth watching closely is that Iran-Oman negotiation over a split shipping corridor that we touched on earlier. Iran clearly wants the world to perceive this as a genuine joint framework, two sovereign neighboring states working cooperatively to manage a shared strait. But if you actually look closely at what's being reported through Iranian state media itself, ships would enter through a northern lane closer to the Iranian coast and exit through a completely separate southern lane closer to Oman's coast. That's Oman quietly building an entirely separate alternative path for global shipping, one that doesn't have to run entirely through Iranian-controlled waters or interact with Iran's sanctioned toll authority at all. If that framework fully solidifies over the coming months, and if global shippers gradually start defaulting to using Oman as their primary point of contact for safe passage guarantees, instead of dealing with Iran's sanctioned Strait Authority, Iran could end up watching its own neighbor quietly become the de facto gatekeeper of the very choke point Iran just spent 6 months, an entire war, and a formal piece of legislation trying to claim exclusive unilateral control over. That would be an extraordinary outcome if it plays out that way. Iran starts down this path partly to assert total dominance over Hormuz and ends up effectively ceding functional control of it to Oman simply because nobody in the shipping industry trusts doing business with a sanctioned Iranian toll authority anymore. Fourth, and worth mentioning briefly because it shapes the broader regional picture, there's also been movement on the Gaza front, with a broader disarmament agreement covering Hamas and other armed groups being finalized this summer. It's a separate track entirely from the Hormuz situation. But it matters here because Hamas has long functioned as one of Iran's proxy networks in the region, funded and armed as part of the same broader IRGC strategy that built the Quds Force's external operations wing. Watching one Iranian-backed proxy structure get formally dismantled through diplomacy, while Tehran simultaneously tries to legislate a permanent extortion racket over Hormuz, tells you something about where Iran's overall regional strategy currently sits. Their military options are shrinking, their proxy networks are under increasing pressure, and this Hormuz law increasingly looks like one of the very few levers they feel they still have left to pull. So let's put all of this together, because this is where the real picture actually comes into focus. Iran is playing a very short-term game with what used to be a very long-term strategic asset. For the last 6 months, Tehran's entire strategy throughout this conflict has consistently been about maximizing pain and leverage in the immediate moment, whatever the long-term cost turns out to be. They lost the air war decisively and quickly. Their integrated air defense network got systematically dismantled piece by piece. Their navy took heavy, sustained losses throughout the conflict. So they pivoted the same way they've repeatedly pivoted throughout this entire war, first to drones, then to proxy militias, then to shoulder-fired missiles smuggled through shell companies routed through Hong Kong and Pakistan. And now they're pivoting once again, this time with paperwork, trying to legislate the exact leverage they can no longer reliably generate through military force. But here's the fundamental miscalculation sitting at the heart of this entire strategy. Military leverage can, in theory, be rebuilt over time, with enough resources and enough patience. Reputational and structural leverage, once you genuinely burn it in the eyes of global markets, is brutally difficult, sometimes nearly impossible to fully rebuild. Every barrel of oil that permanently reroutes through a newly expanded pipeline is a barrel that simply doesn't need Hormuz anymore, full stop. Every insurance company that permanently prices Iran-adjacent shipping routes as elevated long-term risk keeps that premium structurally higher long after the actual guns go quiet. Every international bank that gets burned doing business with a sanctioned Iranian shell company remembers that specific lesson for an entire generation of compliance officers. And every government lawyer who eventually cites this exact piece of legislation in a future arbitration case is pulling directly from a document Iran wrote themselves, debated themselves, and formally published themselves for the entire world to read. Iran didn't just anger the United States with this law. They handed a permanent legal weapon to every shipping company, every insurance underwriter, and every foreign government that will ever want to make the case, in any future dispute, that Iran simply cannot be trusted to responsibly manage control over an international waterway the entire global economy depends on. That's the haunting part of all of this. It's not a missile. It's not a single sanctions announcement. It's a paper trail that Iran built entirely with their own hands, during an active ceasefire in broad daylight for the entire world to permanently read and reference going forward. And honestly, the irony sitting at the center of all this is almost poetic if you step back far enough. Iran wanted to definitively prove that Hormuz was their ultimate leverage, their trump card, their weapon to pull out whenever they wanted global attention or meaningful concessions from Washington. Instead, they may have just proven the exact opposite, that the rest of the world can quietly build entirely around them faster than they can actually hold onto their own choke point. The pipelines keep getting built out further. The alternative shipping corridors keep getting negotiated and formalized. The sanctions list keeps growing longer with every new shell entity they stand up. And this law just sits there permanently on the record as Exhibit 1 in every future conversation about whether Iran can genuinely be trusted with meaningful control over anything the rest of the world actually depends on. What do you think happens next here? Do you think this law actually survives contact with reality once the full economic consequences set in? Or does Iran quietly walk it back once they realize just how much permanent structural damage it's doing to the very leverage they were trying so hard to protect? Let me know exactly what you think down in the comments below. I genuinely read through them, and I'm curious how many of you already saw this compensation clause backfiring before I even got to that section of the breakdown. And if you found this particular breakdown useful, do me a quick favor and hit like on this one. It genuinely helps push these kinds of breakdowns out to more people who are actually trying to understand what's happening in the Gulf right now, instead of just scrolling past a confusing headline without any real context. If you're new here, go ahead and consider subscribing, because we're going to keep tracking this entire Hormuz situation closely as it continues to develop, and there is clearly a lot more still coming down the pipeline. And if you know someone who's been asking what's actually going on with Iran and this new law, go ahead and share this video with them. It'll save you a much longer conversation trying to explain it yourself. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.